Welcome to Homefront. It is Friday with Prof. I am Roman. Here's JP with me. JP, it's Friday. Because it's producer, we can get some music in here. It's Friday day. And today we want to welcome on the set with us, we have Professor Gerard Hutchinson. He's a professor in psychiatry, works with the University of the West Indies, and one of the experts in mental health.
He is
in the country. He's the main man when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, definitely.
Aye. So we have the real man. Welcome, Prof. To our home front. Welcome to our living room, all courtesy dwellings.
Yes.
So
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And welcome. Once more. Now, I heard a phrase this week, right, JP?
Yeah.
Somebody said to me, they said, there is a parallel pandemic taking place in terms of a mental health pandemic, with people being stuck at home under lockdown, the children doing the homeschooling, some people trapped outside the country still, and it seems to be taking a toll on people's mental health. What is your take on this?
Yeah, well, undoubtedly the pandemic is creating a lot of mental health distress from all aspects. The nature of the pandemic, the uncertainty associated with the evolution of the pandemic and how it's affecting the world and, of course, our society here, the various waves that we've been having, and this kind of never-ending struggle to manage and to change and adapt. And, of course, all the restrictions that have been applied as a response to the pandemic, the lockdown, the online school, the unable to go to work, the financial issues. So there are a lot of groups and people in the population who are affected in different ways and for different reasons.
But that's what I'm not going to come to in terms of the different groups that are being affected. As you mentioned, a couple of them. Which group would you say is being affected the most mentally by this pandemic?
Well, mental health is interesting in the sense that the impact of it tends to lag a little bit behind the challenges that people face. Certainly children and adolescents are a big group because of the lack of going to school, the lack of social interaction. Healthcare workers, because of having to interact with the people who are victims of the pandemic in terms of the illnesses. The people who've lost their jobs, the people who are having to deal with a multiple set of stressors because of the pandemic. So certainly I would say almost every population group, the elderly, has vulnerability that has been exposed by the pandemic.
So JP, yeah, go ahead.
So all the Prof, you're saying that we think it's in groups, but it's actually not. It's actually almost the entire population who fall into various groups. So you're saying as a whole is the entire thing. Yeah?
Yes.
So let me hit you with this question, though. We know we're having this strain hitting us right now. We're having the physical effects of it. Do you think the mental health pandemic is bigger, or is it comparable to the physical one? Because I know you're saying it's coming afterwards. It's lagging behind. But people have said it's actually bigger room.
Well, I think the impact will be bigger and perhaps more long-lasting because, for example, with children and adolescents, we don't know what this period being out of school, the issues with social interaction, the focus on the online kind of engagement. So we don't know what impact it's going to have in the years to come. And in terms of their development and how they'll become how they will adjust as adults, having experienced this pandemic. So certainly the potential is extremely great that it could be much worse in the long run.
JP, I'm glad you asked that because if you think about the pandemic as a whole and how it's affecting everyone, it's only a very small part of the population, a very small percentage being affected physically by COVID-19, while everyone else in the population is affected mentally in this whole pandemic with these lockdowns. So Prof, I agree with you that it could be bigger than we're thinking.
So it could be a
in
year
the long
or
run.
2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or until adulthood, Rome.
And as you spoke about adulthood, we want to focus a little bit on the adults, the men and the women. What's happening with that group?
So again, the issue with mental health in men and women is something that I think we haven't taken seriously enough in the past. And what the pandemic is doing and has done is highlight a lot of the issues as they relate to interpersonal relating, the issue of domestic and intimate partner violence, the issues of responsibility in terms of parental responsibility. So, for example, single mothers now who have no support, it's much more difficult for them to deal with the economic problems of the pandemic and also deal with parenting. So again, that's another impact on their children, but also on the stress, on stress
and
for
as
them.
you spoke of stress, and I heard you mention the domestic issues, we have also seen a lot of domestic violence cases cropping up. And with that, we know that a lot of the time is cases where it's the men abusing the women. So could we have a support base for the men? How do we support the men in order to support the women?
That's complex. I think we have to support the women as well. So we have to support the women to support the men to support the women.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay.
Almost like a kind of matrix kind of thing.
Because a lot of the problems that men have are related to their developmental experience. So the experiences that they've had growing up, the experiences that they've been exposed to while growing up, influence the way they deal with the challenges they face as adults. And I mean, starting from the whole maternal experience, you know, supporting mothers at that level, I think that's a major issue that we haven't really taken as seriously as we should. And also in terms of helping men understand their roles as men, is something that has to be done. And of course, that is dependent on various aspects and various sectors in the society.
So essentially, Prof, you're saying that to really deal with the domestic violence issue, there's no shortcut right now. We really have to say we're trying to deal with it as in the next generation, really.
Correct.
So we have to start from now. So you're saying that we as women and men have to really see that young child and make a special effort to modify that man from that time to produce
in
him
order
into a man.
to create the change that we want in the future.
And just piggybacking on this, JP, I knew that when I was growing up, and I'm sure how it was with Prof, and when he was growing up, is that a lot of boys were told, big boys don't cry.
Yeah, definitely.
So if you grew up as a child and they're telling you big boys don't cry, then sometimes you turn into an adult man and you just bottle up all of your emotions and all of your feelings. And some cases I have seen where men don't know how to express themselves, and then sometimes it turns out into violence. So in terms of if you are advising parents in terms of growing up boy children, what would you advise them in that aspect?
Well, certainly allowing them to express themselves, allowing them, as you said, to express their emotional sides, allow them to understand that it's okay to be distressed, and I think most importantly to help them find ways to deal with it more constructively and more positively, because another big component of violence in general and domestic violence in particular is substance use.
Right,
So you find a lot of people who engage in those behaviors, they drink heavily or they use other drugs, and the influence of those drugs contributes to their propensity for violence.
But see, I know we understand it's really a generational thing, but what can I do now? If I'm there as a young mother stuck in a situation where I'm not so much being abused, I could be being abused maybe verbally or so, or physically. What can I do in that environment? I know I've missed a boat. I can't change the man how he is now, but how can I change the circumstance? What can I do?
Well, the key really is to recognize the reality of your situation. I think in many instances, people tend to assume that somehow things are going to get better on one hand, and on the other hand, they don't acknowledge the distress that they're experiencing. Sure. So I think in seeking help and in working through what you're experiencing, you'll get the confidence to deal with the situation in a positive and productive way. And of course, dealing with that means attempting to solve it first, attempting to address why the situation exists, and taking whatever action might be necessary to facilitate that solution. As we're dealing with mental health, subjecting and suggesting that couples go to therapy, try to work through their problems, suggesting that if they're mediating influences that can be introduced into the relationship. But most of all, it's to recognize that you have to protect yourself first, and you have to take care of yourself first. Right. And whatever strategies you have to use to do that have to be employed as the first step in anticipating whatever problems that might arise.
All right. And JP and Prof, this show we're known for touching on touchy topics and some things that people want to know at home, but sometimes they are afraid to ask. We are going to ask you in terms of sex now. Because, JP, I know a lot of couples, and they would have thought that because of the pandemic and because they're under lockdown, that it would have had more sexual interactions between the couples at home. But because they're saying, because they're under so much of mental stress, the sex in the home actually became less than more. Yeah. What is your take on this?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think it's another kind of paradoxical consequence of the pandemic. Now, I think even before the pandemic, sexual behavior was changing, and I think the pandemic has accelerated that. And
tell me more, Prof. I didn't even know it was changing.
So, you know, let's take it up, man. I want to know.
So I mean, if you look at birth rates across the Western world, they're declining. And one of the reasons for that is declining sexual activity. Now, the distinction between sex for pleasure and sex for reproduction is becoming more stark. But more interestingly, you find that people who are in long-term relationships, where the sex for pleasure is perhaps not as acute as it was at the beginning of the relationship, are tending not to have as much sex as they did in the past. And of course, in periods and situations where they're under a lot of stress, that becomes even worse. Of course, one of the negative or one of the potentially negative outcomes of that is that they might seek that sex for pleasure elsewhere.
Sure. Right.
But even in doing that, it's not quite the same, certainly in terms of frequency and in terms of the long-term pleasure they derive from it.
So there's less sex at home and there's less sex outside of home.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think people are searching for a different kind of intimacy. And because intimacy as a response to mental health distress is a very important component of allowing oneself to deal with stressful situations. Intimacy as against purely sexual pleasure.
So expand that a little bit. Yeah, just want to.
We don't get into the
So what kind of intimacy are they looking for in terms of to replace that sexual intimacy? So
well, it is one component of it is of course physical intimacy, but it's more about sharing. It's more about being close to people. It's more about feeling that people are in your corner, that you could, going back to the point about expressing yourself, that you could really expose and express yourself to them in a way that you can't to somebody else who you're not as close to. Right, and that seems to be the thing that people are seeking now in relationships, more so than purely sexual.
But Prof, if we go down that road, right, and we go for this, express yourself, it sounds nice, you know, but then we would end up having declining populations. And in order to keep the population alive and afloat, we had to have children. And if we had to have children, we had to have
sex.
So then how could we boost this, I don't know if this is the sex drive of the couples, or how could we, what would you advise couples in terms of the amount of the number of times they would have had sex as a couple has diminished immensely over time? And how could they boost that? Because a lot of them at home listening, and they are maybe ashamed to ask that, but I know what all they're going through.
You do. So is it because your period, Prof? Is it the twist is that instead of looking for that intimacy, we're looking for non-sexual intimacy, but the trick is to bring back that intimacy, that non-sexual intimacy to your partner, to have now sexual and non-sexual intimacy. Is that a trick?
Yeah. I mean, I think the difficulty is the responsibility component. So the responsibility component means that having sex with a view to having children means there's a responsibility of raising the children. And because women are, focusing on careers, they're getting involved older, they're settling down older.
Sure.
Men too are struggling with the whole responsibility issue in terms of their whole economic and social perspective. So to be able to manage that responsibility is what has to be introduced, and that would include, going back to the pandemic, things like childcare and daycare and support for parents who have children, so that they will feel more comfortable having more children.
I like that, and you mentioned a couple points there that stuck out to me, because I feel that a lot of the mental health issues that people facing because of the pandemic is taking a toll on their relationships as well.
Yeah.
So the whole stressful atmosphere of some people losing their jobs, and then some people have to be homeschooling, it takes away from that time they would have spent, quality time that they would have spent with their partners, and help to boost the relationship itself.
Yeah.
So maybe it could be advisable that they take some time off on their own, just the couple, and work on the relationship, just some quality time.
Definitely.
So Prof, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. It's Friday with the Prof. JP was very insightful once again.
I tell you, I'm just thinking about that seed. It's all about that start. Imagine that, the impact we'll have is really that 2 or 3-year-old child. To me, that blows my mind, definitely.
So thank you all very much for joining us for another Friday with the Prof. Prof, we know we have to bring you back, right? We have to bring you back because we got a lot more to discuss, especially when it comes to mental health in Trinidad and Tobago. This has been Homefront Friday with the Prof. Again, we want to thank Dwellings for our lovely set, and the PED CARES Foundation. Remember, they are the ones that train nurses, they train doctors, they train pediatrics right there in Mount Hope Hospital itself. They support the youth, they support the kids, so you support them. Remember to keep on donating. My name is Rim, this is JP. Thank you very much, Prof. Homefront. Catch you guys next week. That was good. Yeah. I was wondering if